Hello again, and thanks very much indeed for joining us for the final session of the day, which is tackling money laundering. Now, the government's new regulations have been in force for more than a year, and by all accounts, it seems decent progress has been made by law firms to make sure they're on top of the rules and working effectively to close the door on potential ne'er-do-wells. Now, for this session, remember, you can submit questions through the event app, as well as in person using the microphones that are positioned in various parts of the hall. Let's hear first from Richard Collins of the SRA, followed by Lee Ladlow, a financial investigator at the West Midlands Counter-Terrorism Unit. Richard, thank you.
Thank you, It's worth reminding ourselves why money laundering really matters, why tackling money laundering really matters. Of all the areas that we regulate, this isn't absolutely, it's not about troublesome bureaucracy, it's not about bare compliance. This is about preventing drug trafficking, illegal arms dealing, child slavery, and many other crimes from being profitable. And as we'll hear in a moment from Lee, it's also about stopping terrorism. Solicitors are front and centre of this fight. They can be the gatekeepers that make it much more difficult for criminals and terrorists to operate. It's essential if we are to maintain trust and confidence in the profession. And finally, it's also important to keep you and your firms and the people that work in your firms safe. A lot has happened since last year's compliance conference. The Financial Action Task Force has assessed how the UK is doing. Its verdict was published last Friday, and it concluded that, yes, the United Kingdom has a well-developed and robust regime to effectively combat money laundering and terrorist financing. On the whole, the compliance picture is generally improving in relation to lawyers, but there are areas of weakness that still need improvement. These include strengthening supervision and improving the reporting and investigation of suspicious transactions. At the SRA, over the last year, we've developed a range of materials to help support you in tackling money laundering, including guidance, highlighting best practice, and the sector-wide risk assessment. So what does good practice look like? It's not enough to simply want to do the right thing. You need to make sure that you know your risks, you've trained your staff, you know your customers and their sources of funds and wealth, that you're keeping records, and that you're reporting suspicious activity. And many of you are doing this. That's what we found when we published a review earlier this year into how the sector's doing on this issue. Yet it was clear that there was also room for improvement. One key area where we think some firms are not doing as much as they need to is in managing their own risks. Having a risk assessment in place is not only a requirement of the regulations, but it's essential for you and your firm to make sure you understand and can manage the money laundering risks you face. The misconception that money laundering is something that's a risk for other firms is a dangerous one. That is really embarrassing. There should be, that is, I'm sure there'll be a fine box somewhere for me to contribute to. We're still finding too many firms do not have a risk assessment in place, and where we do, we will take appropriate action. The number of SARs submitted by the legal sector has also fallen again, by 12% according to the NCA, and that fall does not match other sectors. Of course, we can all agree that it's quality rather than just quantity that matters when submitting SARs, but the trend of reducing SARs is a potential cause for concern. I know many of you will be doing exactly what you need to do in this area, but given the nature and impact of the risk, there is no room for complacency. Just as firms need to make sure they're on top of these issues, so do we, making sure we're on top of the risks and focusing our energies on the right issues and the right firms. We continue to monitor this issue closely, whether through AI systems that we've developed to focus our attentions on high-risk firms, or the current review we're carrying out on trust and company service providers. It's in all our interests that we get this right. please visit our website or get in touch with our ethics team if you need support. And then we can continue to make sure that solicitors are at the forefront of tackling this problem. Thank you.
Now, Lee Ladlow, Financial Investigator, West Midlands Counter-Terrorism Unit. Lee.
I'm going to say one word. And when I say it, I want you to think about the word and the thoughts and the images that come into your mind. Terrorism. Take a moment, consider it. The pictures that you are most likely to think of are images from the news of devastation it causes. You may have thought about one of the 5 attacks the UK suffered last year, with vehicles being driven at people across London Bridge in an indiscriminate attack. Or maybe scenes from the bombing at Manchester Arena, the sound of the explosion that is heard from within the arena and the panic that befalls the crowd. You might have thought back further to November 2015, where local residents sat unassumingly in bars in Paris, only to be met with the sounds of explosions and gunshots. Or maybe it was the images that are so ingrained into our minds of the 11th of September 2001, when coordinated attacks of terrorism took out the iconic Twin Towers in New York. But terrorism is not simply about the final act that dominates the TV screens when it occurs. It is far more than that. It's about radicalisation, recruitment, facilitation, training, planning, preparation, and of course, finance. If you strip back the final product and look deep into the heart of any committed individual, cell, or organisation driven by extreme ideology, they operate very much like an everyday business. There will usually be a hierarchical structure, a leadership team, media outlets, both in the traditional sense of news agencies and through an increasing use of social media. They have a military wing that trains people in how to use weapons and construct explosive devices. There's logistical support to ensure supplies are in the right place, and a finance section that keeps the books, pays the soldiers, procures the weapons, and controls the funding for the campaign. Be it legitimate or illegally obtained, there is a need for funds to prepare for, facilitate, and conduct attacks. The cost of funding terrorism can range from millions of dollars for the campaign in Syria to just a couple of £100 for the likes of the London Bridge attack. The 11th of September 2001 cost $500,000 to carry out, which seems a lot but pales insignificantly to the $3.3 trillion it cost the US economy. This is the equivalent of $7 million lost to the US economy for every $1 spent by Al-Qaeda. And that is without considering the number of people that were killed or injured in those attacks. The 13th of November 2015, the Paris Bataclan attacks, €73,000 was spent to carry those attacks out. 2,600 of these euros were provided to each terrorist by ISIS chiefs, and the rest was self-funded. Of this, €24,000 was spent on travel, 17,000 on the rental of secret hideouts, and 14,000 on suicide vests and guns. The result, 130 people killed, 413 injured, and over 750 million in lost revenues due to the decline in tourism. And then just last year, the 5 terrorist attacks across London and Manchester put together were estimated to cost just £5,000. But the impact to the UK economy was £3.5 billion, and 37 lives were lost, along with 286 people injured. It is an important thing to note that when we speak about terrorism and ideological extremism, that the focus should not solely be placed on Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group. Currently, within the UK, there are 74 prescribed terrorist organisations, with some of these being homegrown right here in the UK. Although Islamic extremism is often the forefront of media reporting, there are other individuals and groups that are intent on committing acts of terror that have no foundations rooted in the Islamic faith. Just this year, we've seen an unprecedented rise in the number of convictions obtained against people engaged in far-right extremist activity. This afternoon's session is about tackling money laundering, and I was asked to consider 3 things in speaking to you today. Firstly, could I deliver something to bring home how money laundering can fund terrorism? Second, could I provide a real-life example of a case where we brought money launderers who were funding terrorism to justice? And finally, can I provide 2 or 3 practical tips on the signs or types of activity that should raise suspicion of money laundering that might be linked to terrorism? The first thing to consider in answering these questions is what constitutes money laundering. When we answer that, we can determine whether terrorists are engaged in it and how it might apply to the legal profession. In order to be culpable of an offence of money laundering, the property involved, cash or otherwise, must be criminal property. That is, it must constitute a person's benefit from criminal conduct or represent such benefit. Then, to fulfil the money laundering offence, there is a second element where the alleged offender knows or suspects that to be the case and goes on to convert, transfer, remove or conceal or arrange acquisition, retention or control of that property. A simple example would be money stolen from a bank. The stolen money is criminal property and becomes the bank robber's benefit from his or her actions. If the bank robber is a client of yours and you suspect the funds are as a result of their criminal activity, but you did nothing about it and continue to transact on them, and it transpires they were criminal property, then you will be guilty of an offence. So, considering this definition in addressing these points, the first thing that I have to tell you is that money laundering is a distinct and separate act to those of terrorism and terrorist-related finance. Money laundering may and occasionally does present itself in a terrorist investigation, but it is not a necessary feature in order for terrorism or terrorist financing to take place. The sources of the funds that are used for the purposes of terrorism are not always derived from some form of criminal enterprise. If they are legitimately and legally obtained, this cannot be money laundering for the purpose of the act. Let's take a real-life example. A family sympathising with ISIS's ideology wishes to sell their house and use the funds to travel to join the Islamic State to fight alongside them. The house was originally purchased with the aid of a mortgage, and that mortgage has been repaid using a legitimately earned salary. The house is sold and the family receive the funds and use them to travel to Syria and engage with ISIS. There is no criminal enterprise from which the suspect has benefited. The funds from the house sale do not represent criminal property, and therefore this cannot be money laundering, even if the ultimate intention is that the funds will be used to support their involvement in terrorist activity. Therefore, whilst we are here to discuss money laundering, I'm imploring you all to consider that financing of terrorism can and does fall outside the scope of this offence. Legitimately derived finances can be used to support terrorist activities. The onus in helping to detect it lies in the importance of completing your due diligence checks. I do not expect you to have a crystal ball in order to predict the future, but what I am asking is that you not only place scrutiny on the source of the funds and whether they are legitimate or not, but you also question as to what they may be used for when passing them to a client. Please do not become complacent in considering the person to whom those funds are going to. When making those considerations, it is important to remember that funding terrorism is not just about buying the materials to make bombs. Propaganda distributed by extremist groups makes it incumbent of sympathisers and supporters that, where they are unable to engage in direct action, they do their bit by donating to the cause. These donations can sometimes take convoluted routes across various countries and community members through legitimate and informal transfer systems before they reach their final destination. Also consider training needs. Individuals will travel to theatres of war to receive training in how to construct improvised explosive devices, although that should be caveated because with the advance of technology, instructions have become openly available on the internet, allowing people to self-radicalise and become self-taught. There is also the existence of people who act as radicalisers or within facilitation networks. Those that prey on vulnerable and naive individuals to convince them the right path is one of war against Western societies, and in doing so provide them funding or facilitation to develop and further their own extremist ambitions against society. Even the production and distributing of media that may incite or be useful to a prospective terrorist needs to be funded, and these are all examples of terrorist finances as well, and all are prosecutable. So what are the sources of funds that terrorists rely on? Through my experience, there is no one mechanism from which they will obtain their funding. I've seen terrorists use legitimately earned salaries, government-issued benefits, loans, both legitimate and illegally obtained, credit cards, charity collections, third-party donations, family gifts, liquidation of assets, and fraud, both conventional and cyber-enabled. A terrorist intent on martyring themselves is not worried about the burden of debt. They have no concerns about meeting repayments. Their focus is on achieving the ultimate goal of killing in the name of their ideology. So let me give you some brief examples of real-life investigations. In 2011, we received details of a credible plot to detonate IEDs, that's improvised explosive devices, against unspecified UK-based targets. It was established that members of a cell affiliated to Al-Qaeda were conducting charity collections right here in Birmingham. The collections were targeted in areas heavily populated with members of the Asian community and took place during the month of Ramadan, where a higher obligation to provide donations was placed upon them. The group collected for 23 days, amassing an estimated £53,000, and when work was conducted with the council and charity, it was established they were only actually licensed to collect for one of those days. Therefore, the majority of the money had been collected fraudulently, and thus this becomes the criminal property for the purpose of money laundering. The change that was collected was converted via automated counting machines in the front of supermarkets and then deposited into the banking system. From there, £24,000 was transferred to an online Forex trading account with the intention that this would generate more money to finance a first wave of attacks against the UK and facilitate 4 new recruits to Pakistan for training and to fund a second wave of attacks on their return. However, through bad trades, a considerable amount of money was lost, and legitimate applications for bank loans were then considered and applied for in order to try and recover some lost funds. These individuals were subsequently arrested and convicted, but is a prime example of criminal property being laundered for terrorist purposes. A second example highlights the necessity for due diligence. In 2015, we were investigating a group holding an extreme ideology, during where one of the individuals fraudulently obtained 2 loans. This was facilitated by an associate who was working at a bank. And it transpired that in 2010, when the associate applied to join the bank, on the day he signed his contract in his original name, he attended a solicitor's firm and completed a statutory declaration to change it. In support, he simply produced his passport to the solicitor to verify his identity. No questions were asked of him and the deed was signed. The following day, he submitted his new name to the DVLA to change his driving licence, but retained his old one on his passport and also failed to notify the bank that he'd changed his name. For 2 years, he continued to operate using both identities, to which the bank were oblivious. And then after that time, bank records showed that he effectively interviewed himself to open a bank account and credit card in the new name. 3 years later, using his alias and abusing his position of trust, he helped to facilitate his friend to conduct a £50,000 fraudulent loan application, with it being believed that those funds were going to be used towards attack planning activities. The final example stems from a prosecution case that concluded this year. A number of individuals were convicted for their involvement in the right-wing extremist group National Action, where one of those people involved purchased a house with the sole intention of it being used to facilitate the storage of recruitment aids, ideological material, and hold mass meetings to radicalise and formulate attack planning activity. The house purchase was recorded in the name of the spouse only, but was financed by 2 methods. A joint mortgage between the defendant and spouse, where the repayments were being made solely by the defendant, and a £10,000 transfer that came from the defendant's spouse's father in Finland. The only check conducted during that conveyance was observation of a single page of a bank statement which appeared to show the transfer of the money from Finland with the word gift attached. No questions were asked why the property was being transferred to the spouse's name only, especially given the joint mortgage being put into place, nor checks to identify the repayments coming solely from the defendant's accounts. No questions were asked either about the origin of the £10,000 that had come from Finland. But what I can tell you is that through police intelligence, the £10,000 is connected to a member of an organised crime group in Finland, which has only been identified as a subsequent result of our terrorist investigation. Had a disclosure to authorities been made at the time of the conveyance, the house may never have been bought to facilitate the activities, and more importantly, the defendant and the affiliates could have been identified at an earlier stage, and the suspected criminal money wouldn't have been laundered via the property purchase. So to the final question on signs of money laundering associated to terrorism. I can tell you there is no one single typology or method that I can provide you that identifies terrorist financing. Just as they are indiscriminate in whom they attack, they are indiscriminate in how the funds are sourced. Not all terrorists will engage in criminal activity or be involved in money laundering. As I earlier mentioned, the focus must not only be on where did the money come from, but also where it is going to and for what purpose. Obvious identifiers for potential money laundering would include things such as significant balances with no legitimate source of income, multiple transactions in and out from third parties, large movements of cash in short periods of time. But take a moment to look at other transactions as well. Do bank statements exhibit extended periods out of the country or expenditure that demonstrates convoluted routes through Europe? Are there a significant number of purchases with companies that deal in chemicals? The accumulation of a number of loans and credit facilities that are obtained in quick succession? Or is a large proportion of the funds seen entering and leaving via digital currency methods and exchanges? Because at the moment, there is an increasing rise in what we are seeing, and it's easier to hide the activity via this method. I'm not saying that all of these circumstances will lead to launderers of money, but they certainly should afford closer scrutiny. You're also in a fortunate position of not only being able to request the documentation to examine, but to have the person in front of you to answer the questions. How quickly and confidently can those questions be answered? Does the person appear nervous and irritable, or do you think they're being evasive? If you have an inkling that something's not right, it probably isn't, and in those cases, I would ask you to consider making a disclosure. That obligation is placed upon you under the money laundering regulations, and while such obligation does not exist for terrorist financing, I'm asking you to make a moral decision to also disclose. I'm not suggesting from the information that is available to you, you will be able to uncover a terrorist plot, but raising a report could provide the vital piece of the jigsaw to law enforcement that affords that person enough scrutiny to determine if they are involved in terrorism. The enforcement agencies of the UK would rather examine 1,000 disclosures and be able to conclude that there is nothing untoward about each and every one of those than have one non-disclosure that results in a repeat of the atrocities that have previously befallen the country in the past year. Thank you.
Lee, thanks very much indeed for that. Now, we all know that the problem of money laundering clearly isn't one that just affects the legal sector. It's something that government, society, and business all together need to tackle. And of course, the regulations and laws around all this are set by central government. And that's reflected in our panel today, which covers a range of different perspectives. So in addition to Richard and Lee, we have Tina Bloxhich, the nominated officer at the Lloyds Banking Group. She has extensive experience in the banking financial services sector and is a former chair of the Institute of Money Laundering Prevention Officers. Amasis Saba is Compliance Manager and Deputy MLRO at Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner. He is also Chair of the Law Society's Money Laundering Task Force, as well as Chair of the Institute of Money Laundering Prevention Officers. And Claire Wilson is a Senior Manager and MLRO at the Gambling Commission, where she leads the regulator's work to tackle money laundering in the British gambling market. She previously had 15 years' experience working in the gambling industry. It's great to have you all with us. Thank you for joining us. Tina, if I could start with you, how well do you think the battle in tackling money laundering from the perspective of banks is going?
Thanks, Clive. The banking industry, probably contrary to many people's views perhaps, do invest heavily, multi-millions, in their financial crime prevention systems to protect and reduce social harm. We actually are the greatest invested sector amongst many sort of peers, including those in the room. A reflection of that is actually we are the greatest reporter into the National Crime Agency with respect to SARS. However, criminals are very inventive, they're very creative, and whilst we're heavily invested and we're trying to do the right thing, it's actually quite an uphill battle to keep up to pace with what the criminals are up to.
Okay, Amasis, what's the view from the Law Society?
I think it echoes some of the comments that have come before, and I think the mutual evaluation, which is the best one that any country has ever had, I think shows that it's a bit like my old school reports, doing well, but with some room for improvement still.
All right. Okay. And Claire, you know, we've heard of the gambling machines helping drug dealers turn dirty money into clean money. William Hill paying 6.2 million for systemic failures regarding money laundering. How well is the gambling industry dealing with all this?
Okay, it's interesting for the gambling industry because the gambling industry is almost split into two sectors. You have those that are regulated and supervised under the money laundering regulations, as well as the Gambling Act. And then you have the rest of the gambling industry, for example, betting, as you just referred to, Clive, bingos, society lotteries, the National Lottery, for example, that fall under the Proceeds of Crime Act. So they have different legal requirements to comply with and different thresholds to meet. If I can focus on the regulated sector in terms of casinos, which has also had a lot of publicised casework, which you can see on our website. Operators have come from a position where they were not placing compliance with regulations and preventing money laundering at the very heart of what they should be doing. They almost placed it alongside profit and also commercial drivers. Right. What I would say is that those businesses that manage to place it on the same footing as commercial imperative will actually end up being the most successful businesses. They'll avoid civil litigation, civil recovery. They'll avoid non-compliance and the publicity that comes from that and how it affects their shares and the dividends that they can pay out.
Okay. I want to open it up to the floor now. Don't forget, you can use the app to send in some questions, and hopefully we'll get through them. But first questions for our panel on money laundering and dealing with it. Any questions? Don't forget the microphones are at the front and in the middle of the hall there. No questions? You're all on top of the money laundering situation in your firms, are you? You're all on top of it. Well, tell you what, let me ask one question that's already come in to us from the app. This is from Alex. Will all solicitors involved in a matter be able to rely on one AML search done, regardless of which firm does it?
No. No. Please don't do that. Just...
See, there was a point to asking that question.
Yeah, and I understand where the question is, and I think there has been a big move, and I think it's interesting that it was considered as an AML check or what CDD do I need to do. That's not it. I think that is it's part of a continuum that we've been on over 10 years ago. That's it. That's all I was allowed. No, you missed. That was a brilliant answer as well. It's sort of 10 years ago, the idea was we need a passport. We need to make sure we've got a passport. That's what I understand is the AML check. And once I've done that, we're all good.
Where's it gone again?
But then, yeah, oh, sorry.
There we go.
But try not to lean too much.
There we go. Expert help.
Thank you. But I think it's important now. Oh, I was much deeper on the other one. I like that one. But I think the bigger issue is to make sure you understand the risks of what you're doing. Each firm will be different. So the checks that will be appropriate for your firm will be different to the ones done for another one. So what they may be doing on the transaction is different potentially to what you do. You need to make sure if the SRA knocks on your door and says, why were you happy? Because somebody else will not help you, not to make you too nervous. It's important that you all do your own risk assessment and you understand what's going on in this transaction. Why are we happy with where the money's from? And just because it's from Tina, I mean, if it's from Tina, that's fine. But if it's from, just because it's from a regulated bank is not the tick. You need to make sure you're comfortable, you understand what's going on.
Richard, what does good practice look like?
I mean, good practice looks like, firstly, all the things Amasis has said, do not rely on others in the chain, particularly because it's about understanding your own risks arising from the transactions you're undertaking and understanding the risks posed by the individual clients. And it's about putting in place those systems and applying them and training staff to follow them. And the SRA doesn't expect that there will never be any failure. No firm will ever get any of this wrong. That's not our approach. But what we're really worried about is firms that just aren't trying. So put in place the systems, understand your clients, understand the transactions, train your staff, and consistently apply that throughout the business. Because what we're mainly concerned about is firms who are either unwilling or incapable of doing those things. For firms who are genuinely putting in place the systems, trying to apply them, They have nothing to worry about from the SRA. We are desperately trying to support those firms. It's the firms that are either unwilling or just incompetent in doing that work that we're concerned about.
All right, this is a question for Lee then. This is from Julie. When we do discover a fraud, the police are not interested. So where does that leave us? Whoa. Was that Julie? Stand up, Julie. Nah, she ain't standing up. No.
I would say the police are interested. There is a massive volume of fraud. It's an increase in crime that we are seeing across the UK through various different reporting systems, and we try and put those in place through the likes of Action Fraud. The volume is tremendous. It's not that we won't do something about it. It's about what we can do about it and having a look at it in terms of the investigation. We're also limited in terms of the resources that we have as the police, as you're fully aware. There are budget restraints at the moment, and there are severe cuts that are happening to the police. But we still will work. Every crime that is reported has to be looked at. It has to be investigated. So it's not a case of it being ignored. Sometimes it's a case of maybe it's going to take some time before it gets to those specialist investigators that have those skills to be able to have a look at that and allocate the time and the resources to be able to look at the fraud.
Okay. I think this one is for you, Amasis. This is from Pearl. What systems do firms have in place for sourcing funds, questioning and recording the answers?
Don't want to be as unhelpful as possible, but it's going to depend on you and your firm. We use Intap, which manages the needs of an international firm with offices all over the world. It would probably not be appropriate for a one-man band. I think it will depend on what you want, but I think ultimately we always use the embarrassment test. If somebody knocks on the door and I've got to defend it, am I going to look like an idiot if all I've got is, but the client told me it was okay? Now, it may be in some circumstances that backed up with other things you can find online, that may be okay. But it's a case of when you document it, does it work? Post-it notes are fine. If that works for your firm, it's not a high recommendation, please don't take that away, but making sure that as long as you've documented what you did and why you were comfortable, and you need to have done it at the time, because if you're trying to do it once you get the knock on the door, that just doesn't look good, and odds of you being able to remember effectively is always going to be a challenge. I think that the key part of making sure you've documented why it was there, and where that can sometimes trip people up is, it was obvious. I didn't need to write it down. That's fine today, but if you're trying to remember in 5 years' time why it was obvious, or somebody else is looking at the file then, it may not be so. If it's not written down, it never happened, as far as audit and presumably the SRA will be considering when they knock on the door. And I think it does link back all the way to the risk assessment. What do you think is appropriate for your firm? And if your risk assessment is only a page long, odds are good you haven't considered all the risks. If it doesn't reference the SRA's risk assessment or the legal sector guidance on AML or the national risk assessment, odds are good you've not able to demonstrate you've considered all the risks. If you've just got one from the website, from an online source and just changed your name at the top, that will probably show you haven't considered the risk for your firm. But in terms of what you need to do, it's if somebody asked you to justify why you were comfortable in taking this money and representing this client, what do you have to show that it was a good idea at the time? Sorry, that's not a, here's the correct answer.
Not to worry, not to worry. Tina, the banking sector is right on the front line of this, the sharp end. What lessons do you think the banking sector's learned that could be passed on to the folks here?
I think Professor hindsight is a great thing, first of all. And Amasis has you know, perfectly summarised that. I think the number of times where something looked too good to be true, well, actually, was it too good to be true? And making sure that you've actually got that evidence in your records to show a regulator or law enforcement. So if Lee rocks up to my bank and starts asking questions about why we didn't detect that terrorist activity, is there some reasonable reason why we did miss the red flag? Did we look at it carefully and so on? again, I can't emphasise enough, there is a huge amount of investment in systems and controls, in people awareness, and that includes telling the war stories, socialising those, and actually learning from, you know, just the huge expanse of criminality that's out there. And we've heard a lot today, Clive, from sort of Paul Richard and in the various sessions in the theatres about, you know, the harm that this stuff does. And certainly for us as a bank, it's not an easy, you know, situation. We've got in excess of 30 million customers, trillions of payments going through. And I do feel for Lee as well. In terms of fraud, it's huge, guys. And unfortunately, we see you as law firms that we may bank, where you've got client accounts with us, or maybe you're transacting where there has been a CEO in effect, you know, diversion on a payment fraud. And it goes really quickly. So we're trying to track it and lock it in real time for you, but we can't always be that back-end control for you.
Okay, we've got a question down the front here. If you could stand up, give us your name and where you're from. Thank you.
My name is Tahir Khan. I'm from Lowland Solicitors. My question is this, that obviously I've just heard that we have to do all the checks and ensure everything and tick all the boxes. Obviously there are so many case management systems which are available in the market nowadays. Who is regulating them? And when they come and sell their products, would it not be wise that they should be going through SRA first, so that all the checks are carried out before we as a firm who are on receiving end at the end of the day buy those products and we given all the assurances from them? So I just want to hear from the panel because the IT sector is going so fast and people are out there selling their products. So is it not a vulnerability in terms of SRA and all of us to do something about that?
Okay.
That's my question.
Richard, can you address that one?
I agree with the point completely. I think one of the keys to this is to build these checks in to your systems and the way your firm operates. So, you know, I understand completely that it's difficult at times running a law firm. You've got lots of competing demands, huge financial pressures. And one of the ways to deal with that and to make sure that these checks are carried out is just completely build the operation of these checks into your everyday system, so it just becomes second nature. And one key part of that will be to make sure it's built into your IT systems, into your case management systems. So the SRA more than happy, absolutely, to talk to the main IT software providers. I know we do anyway, and we'd be more than happy to talk to them if approached, and I'm sure the Law Society is similar. The Law Society have a very good relationship with many of the case management system providers.
Okay, I've got a question here which will please you, Tina. I've had an issue, this is from Zoe, I've had an issue with a counterfeit check very recently, and the bank Lloyds were great. The systems in place worked, but do I still report this to the SRA?
I don't think that's a question for Lloyds to
No, I
respond
think that's a question. That's question. And Richard's pondering here.
Yeah, well, no, I'm not sure whether reporting a counterfeit check to the SRA is the right thing. I mean, if it's a counterfeit check that's come from another solicitor, maybe you'd want to. But if it's a counterfeit check and...
Probably more than likely.
And you believe it's part of, falls within the ambit of the money laundering regulations, it's maybe something more appropriate for a suspicious activity report if you feel it falls within in that category.
Yeah, I would echo that, Clive.
Sure.
I would certainly encourage people to make a disclosure to the NCA.
Right.
Because whilst you may not get immediate feedback on that item, actually it will be taken on board as part of intelligence profiling.
Okay. Claire, I mean, you've been on both sides of the fence, being regulated and working for the regulator. In this regard with money laundering, how does it differ from either side?
Yeah, okay, so you're quite right, Clive. I've been on both sides, and from the private sector's point of view, the priority, certainly when I was working in the private sector, and I'm sure it's still the same now, is obviously around profit. It's around profit for the company, it's around profit for shareholders, And that puts a unique pressure on frontline staff. It puts a unique pressure on those managers who have got oversight of anti-money laundering within an organisation. Does that lead to some cutting corners? Possibly. Does that mean some of them have got eyes on too many balls? Possibly. However, from a regulator's point of view, and I'll echo what I said before, very often those firms that we've seen be most successful are those that have put regulation at the heart of what they do. It gives them a commercial advantage to their competitors. That's something that people find difficult sometimes to understand, but you are in turn protecting yourself from the regulator scrutiny sometimes, or from external civil recovery from the police, or either from civil litigation from customers that have been, feel they've had some wrongdoing. So, yes, that would be the answer. Profit drives behaviour in the private industry, and I would say in regulation, put it at the forefront of what you do, and the commercial will work better.
Oh, okay. Question over there. Thanks. If you could just head over to the microphone. Thanks very much.
Robert Davidson and Co. I'd just like to come back on Nick Maundrell, his comments about fraud. I have an issue with fraud at the moment. I reported fraud, suspected fraud, about 2 months ago through Action Fraud. I've heard nothing except computer-generated responses. I can't contact anybody at the fraud department. The client has been contacted. He can't get back either. In the meantime, the suspected fraudster is walking around free and could probably leave the country if he wanted to. Why will you not, or why, it may not be a question for you, but why will the fraud department not cooperate more? At least we know where we stand. I can use the civil route if necessary. But if I'm in limbo, which is what Action Fraud has asked me to do, is essentially do nothing, we're stuck.
Okay, Lee?
So Action Fraud's undergoing a review at the moment in terms of their reporting process, and they're actually looking at divulging it back down to local forces. Action Fraud is centrally based out of the City of London. It was a mechanism that was put into place because the volume of fraud that was being reported got so great that it wasn't being looked at and handled properly. They're now looking at redivulging it back down to the local forces as well. I can't speak about your specific case as to whether it's then has subsequently come down to the local force for it to be looked at or not. It's essentially assessed and evaluated by Action Fraud and the team in London, and then they will divulge it. So there is a little bit of a process in place. In terms of your immediate concern around the fraudster, I would suggest to contact your local police about it as well. I know there's the Action Fraud process online. If you have a suspect that you think you can identify, then that makes it easier for us to then start the whole prosecution process in terms of bring that person in, speaking to them and collecting the evidence. So sometimes Action Fraud it's not as good as it can be cracked up to be. It's the mechanism really for processing. But where there's an identifiable suspect, then I'd urge you to speak to the local police as well about it and start working and liaising with them. And they'll put you in touch with the local economic crime units that will be able to assist you and have got those specialisms and facilities to be able to help investigate that for you.
Okay. Question for, I think this is probably for you, Richard. This is from Shauna. I assume freelance solicitors are expected to comply with AML CFT regulations as well. How practical is this? What support mechanisms will be given to them?
I think it's yes, they will be expected to comply. We have a whole range of guidance and help for solicitors, from online resources, our ethics helpline, people can phone them. And also importantly, I think it really is worth emphasising, This is an area where the SRA and the Law Society are pretty much joined at the hip. We feel we have a joint responsibility to help the profession to meet its obligations in respect of anti-money laundering. There's very good levels of cooperation, and I believe there are sort of complementary sources of help and information from both the SRA and the Law Society. So I would urge people to look to both sources and see what advice and guidance really works for you and your firm in the context of the business that you're doing.
Okay, here's one from Gemma. Dealing with an individual client after an NCA report has been made very tricky. Do the panel have any guidance on what communication can be made?
In the absence of more, so you've made a report, presumably for consent, you've got consent, you've carried on, or is this in the gap between you've made a report but you've not yet got consent? Does anyone want to? Let's assume it's the one where you've got consent. I think the question is, are you happy having made a report about somebody you suspect of money laundering to still act for them? And there may be definitely cases where, for your own reasons and assessment, you are happy to do so. You can't tell them about the report, but if the reason you made a report and you haven't already told them by telling them that you're going to have to make a report with them, remember it's not tipping off if you're making sure that they're aware of their own legal obligations as well. I think it's, if you've got doubts, you can try and talk to the NCA, and you can still do that. If you send them an email, they will seek to help if you've got concerns about what should be happening. But there is a question of, do you really want to still act for them? I think might be something you want to consider carefully. If you're at the point where you don't feel you can communicate effectively with your client, I feel you might end up walking towards the conclusion yourself. If you are and you're happy to work with them but weren't happy to tell them that you need to make a report with them, I think you want to make sure you can justify and document that. In the absence of further, that's a tricky one. If you want to grab me afterwards, happy to have a chat, but not legal advice, just a chat.
Clive,
Yeah, Dina, yeah.
on that. Certainly in the banking sector, it's a huge issue. I mean, we're disclosing, tens and tens and hundreds of thousands of SARs. And, yeah, sorry, shall I use that? Yeah. So for the banking sector, it's a real challenge. If it's a standard SAR disclosure for intelligence purposes, Amasis is quite right. That will trigger a review in terms of our customer relationship and whether we can actually get comfortable with continuing to bank someone under those circumstances. Where we seek consent, that's a different story, especially under the Criminal Finances Act with the extension of the moratorium period. You can be up to 6 months holding on to funds and not being able to potentially tell the customer what it's all about. Although there is provision now with the extended moratorium to actually tell the customer. But certainly up to the original moratorium periods, it is a very, very challenging situation. And that customer engagement about what you can and can't say, as Amasis alluded to, is pretty difficult, particularly when you've got the tipping off provision there. However, if you have concern on the account, the underlying activity, you should be making reasonable inquiries about what's going on. Obviously, for you guys, it's a transaction. It's more around, particularly if you've got a large mortgage you're trying to complete on, and you can't get comfortable about source of funds, source of wealth in relation to that property. Again, and you've got significant timescales to meet. Again, it can be particularly challenging. But the NCA are very helpful. And if you do reach out to them and you really express your issues and challenges, they will support you. But it is a very, very challenging situation, and that's unfortunately the complexity of Proceeds of Crime Act.
Amasis?
I think there's one other quick follow-up to that. Please remember that consent is not a replacement for CDD. Submitting a consent to the National Crime Agency saying, I haven't been able to get comfortable about source of wealth, or I haven't been able to complete CDD, that's not a consent. That's, you haven't complied with the money laundering regulations properly. And fully expect that the NCA will pass those or may pass those on to the SRA. be conscious of what you're reporting for. So with the check one earlier, think about whether or not there are actual proceeds of crime that you're reporting. Proceeds of crime, NCA, attempted fraud, action fraud.
I think this will be our final question. This is from someone called Clive, who will be chairing this conference next year. And I think this is an interesting question. I think one that we should touch on, and perhaps Lee, you can answer this. Hearing the terrorism issues, I wonder how far you can go with making inquiries about the source of funds without being accused of racism or racial stereotyping.
You've got to think about what you're actually looking at. If you have got that suspicion, at the end of the day, as a police officer, we get racism thrown up quite a lot of times, especially when we have these people brought into custody and we're interviewing them. You've got to look at the offence that's in hand, the reasons why you've got that suspicion in the first place, around those transactions and what sort of digging you want to do. It's not about racism and bringing racism. You will get people that will throw that into your face. And you just have to make it abundantly clear that that is not what the issue is about, really. That you have genuine, serious concerns about where their source of funds is coming from. And that will allow you then to make the inquiries. If they are raising those sort of flags, though, sometimes they're doing it in order to try and divert your attention away from where that source of funds has come from. They're trying a distraction technique. They don't want you to chase that or follow that money source because they know where it leads ultimately. Remember, they're fully in the seat of knowledge. They know where that money's come from, and it's your job really to find out where that's come from to see whether it's safe to continue that transaction on. So if they've got the opportunity to try and dissuade you by playing a racial card or some other card, then I would suggest then just sitting down with them and explaining that you have your duties to the regulators under the money laundering regulations to look at those transactions and make sure that they are safe transactions for you to proceed and act on. Otherwise, you are putting yourselves and your own businesses in jeopardy. And you yourself will also potentially be guilty of committing an offence of money laundering as well. You've got to deal with it sympathetically, but ultimately you have those obligations upon you in your industries to conduct those checks and do it in respect of the money laundering regulations.
All right. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to leave it. Claire, Amasis, Tina, Lee, and Richard. Thank you all very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings to a close the SRA Compliance Conference for 2018. My sincere thanks goes out to everyone involved today. We had some great sessions, and from the feedback I've been getting, there have been a lot of useful conversations at the marketplace stands too. It always fascinates me as a journalist to come to events like this because it actually helps me in my day job. If I have to do a news piece now or present an item on the SRA or Law Society, the Legal Ombudsman, or cuts to legal aid, whatever it is, I do so now from a position of a little bit of knowledge and strength. And I've been keenly aware of just how passionate all of you are about your chosen profession and the self-evident commitment there is to high standards and getting things right. There may have been a few disagreements today and a pitch invasion. But you all want the same thing: prosperous businesses and happy clients. Now, the SRA is keen to know what you thought of the conference this year. You'll all get a follow-up email with a feedback survey, so please take the time to fill it out. It really will help the folks here. Alternatively, you can use the app, and there's a little feedback button on it, which you can do straight away before you go. All your comments will help the SRA build on today and make next year's event even better. For those of you who like to plan ahead, next year's event will take place here again on October the 30th. And in this uncertain Brexit world, one thing is guaranteed. Your host will almost certainly be called Clive. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all. Goodbye.